The honourable member for Regina, Lewvan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The debate that we just heard about benefits for people with serious illnesses reminds me that just yesterday we lost to cancer Paul Dewar, the former MP for Ottawa Centre. There have already been some wonderful tributes in this House. I would just add that I had the honour of volunteering on his first election campaign and seeing firsthand what a great person he was. He was also a great parliamentarian, and if he were here, he would probably encourage me to get on with the adjournment debate. So on that note, I would remind the House that the question that prompts these adjournment proceedings was about the carbon emissions from cannabis production. Now, of course, growing cannabis indoors under bright lights is extremely energy intensive. Academic research has concluded that cannabis production in the United States emits about as much carbon as 3 million cars. The first part of my question was to ask the government whether it could provide those kind of statistics for our country. And of course, we might speculate that indoor heating and lighting might require even more energy in Canada than south of the border. On the other hand, electricity in Canada is a bit less carbon intensive on average, but rather than speculate, it would be nice to see some actual data. I know this government prides itself on evidence-based policy, and I'm hoping this evening we'll hear some actual numbers about how much carbon is emitted through cannabis production in our country. Today, I noticed Statistics Canada released its National Cannabis Survey, which contained a great deal of data about the sector, some good information, but nothing on the associated carbon emissions, and I'm hoping the Parliamentary Secretary will be able to help us out on that. Now, of course, beyond quantifying the level of carbon emissions from cannabis production, what we really want is for the government to take action to limit and to minimize those emissions. I think one of the strongest arguments in favor of legalizing cannabis is that it gives the opportunity to regulate the sector. And I'd like to know what actions the government has taken to try to minimize the carbon emissions from cannabis production through regulation. I would note, Mr. Speaker, that businesses are clamoring to get licenses to be allowed to produce cannabis. It strikes me that it should be possible to make those licenses conditional upon them committing to produce the cannabis in an environmentally friendly way. So licensing requirements might be one tool. Perhaps the Parliamentary Secretary will speak to other tools that could be used. But I would just note that through legalization, the government is effectively setting up an entirely new industry of cannabis production. And that setting up of a new industry is really a golden opportunity to make sure that that industry is structured in a sustainable way. So I think it's important for the government to get this right. It's rare that the government has this opportunity to really launch a new industry and have so much influence over how it's going to be set up. So I'm really keen to hear from the Parliamentary Secretary about what the government has done and is doing to minimize the amount which cannabis production adds to Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Thank you. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member for his intervention on this issue and also for his tribute to Paul Dewar, whose loss I also mourn today. Our government has taken a responsible approach to cannabis that includes legalizing, strictly regulating and restricting access to cannabis in order to get profits out of the hands of criminals and cannabis out of the hands of youth. As it relates to our climate action, our government is taking leadership at home and abroad. We're taking concrete steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, support clean growth, and build climate-resilient infrastructure. In addition to being among the first countries to sign and ratify the Paris Agreement, Canada is following through on its Paris commitments by implementing a national plan to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030 and to build resilience to the impacts of climate change. We have a climate change plan. The Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change is the first climate change plan in Canada's history to include collective and individual commitments by federal, provincial, and territorial governments. Our plan has more than 50 concrete measures, including a pan-Canadian approach to pricing carbon pollution, as well as new policies, programs, and regulations to reduce emissions in every sector of the economy, build resilience to the impacts of climate change, foster clean technology solutions, and create good jobs that contribute to a strong economy. A key pillar of the framework is putting a price on carbon pollution. When pollution is not free, people and businesses are motivated to pollute less. Our analysis found that carbon pollution pricing in Canada will reduce Canada's greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 60 million tons by 2022. That's equivalent to closing more than 30 coal-fired electricity plants. In the provinces of Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and New Brunswick, the federal backstop carbon pricing system will be in place to protect the environment and to spur innovation. Any direct proceeds collected will go directly back to people in these provinces. Households will receive a climate action incentive, which will give most families more than they pay under the new system. Funds will also be given to the province's schools, hospitals, businesses, and Indigenous communities to, for example, help them become more energy efficient and reduce emissions, helping Canadians save even more money and to improve our local economies. The framework also contains important additional actions to reduce emissions across all sectors of the economy, including phasing out coal-fired power plants, developing new building codes, and regulating methane emissions. We're also protecting and enhancing carbon sequestration in our forests and in our agricultural sectors, as well as supporting clean technology and innovation. We've covered a lot of ground since launching the Pan-Canadian Framework, and we are just starting to see its results. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Regina Lewvan.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for providing what I think was a very good overview of the government's general policies for trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But what I was hoping to do in this evening's adjournment debate was really drill down on what the government is or could be doing to minimize the emissions from cannabis production specifically. I'm sure it's a small part of total emissions for the country, but it is an area over which the government has quite a bit of influence during this period of legalization. I appreciate the government might have been caught off guard by this rather esoteric question when I first asked it back in October, but I guess I would like to ask the Parliamentary Secretary in her final minute to provide a little bit more information, if possible, about what specifically the government is doing to address carbon emissions from cannabis production. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, a great deal of effort continues to be devoted to implementing our climate plan and reducing emissions. We've also established a robust reporting and oversight mechanisms to track and drive implementation of the Pan-Canadian Framework, including annual reports to First Ministers and to Canadians. The second annual synthesis report on the status of the Pan-Canadian Framework implementation was published on December 2018. Our government is committed to transparency for Canadians as we continue to take steps towards meeting our Paris Agreement target. Thank you.